I'm sure you know what tonight's talk is about. It's totally dependent on this book by Herbert Crosney called The Lost Gospel, The Quest for the Gospel of Judas Iscariot. At the top of the book, this is a New York Times bestseller. This book sold phenomenally well in America. The whole book is about how, from the time the manuscript was discovered around 1979, right down to about 2006, when National Geographic got hold of it, just everything that happened. And I'm only giving you just an outline this evening. There's more of the same sort of stuff, betrayal, that I haven't got time to cover. So, it's amazing just what circumstances went around the Gospel of Judas when it was first discovered. All right. I mentioned to you before that it was discovered in 1979 in what's called Alminia. That's a province of Egypt, and its nickname is the Alminia manuscript. And the story is that the Fellahin, same as with the Gnostic texts, the whole lot that were found down further south in Egypt, Fellahin found it in a cave in a limestone box in the tomb that was in the cave. And it was picked up there by somebody by the name of Samia, who sold it to a local antiquities dealer in Cairo called Hannah Asabil. Hannah Asabil was a Coptic Christian. He belonged to the Coptic Church, and he lived in Cairo. But like so many people in his profession, he just was crooked one way or the other. And he gave quite a number of different stories about how he'd got hold of the manuscript and how it come into his hands, and how he claims he had paid $2,000 for it. Ludwig Koenen, who was somebody who was involved heavily in the the research into how this manuscript was discovered, says in his book, "When I lived in Egypt, I learned that you cannot trust what the seller or dealer tells you. Exaggerating, deceiving, and even outright lying are all part of negotiating in the Egyptian souk," which doesn't surprise me to hear that at all. And a friend of Hannah's, a colleague of his, describes what the relationship was between him and the dealers. There were about 4 or 5 dealers in the souks of Cairo who were selling off ancient, artifacts and what have you. And they had an agreement among themselves that they would pool the resources of everything that they earned, so that each one would, every month get an equal salary. That was the agreement, not necessarily honored. And Hannah, this guy, continually cheated on his colleagues by not even paying them their funds when it was agreed to, and then by concealing a number of his sales as well. So here comes betrayal number 1. He's literally betraying his own colleagues by not paying them what he was supposed to pay them, and by not telling them the truth about many of the sales. These names are only pseudonyms. We don't really know who these guys were, but these are the names that they had or were given in the research for the manuscript. When he finally started disclosing that he had this manuscript, this old ancient book, going back obviously as it was 1600 years, he said that he had no idea what it was. He looked at it, but he couldn't tell you himself what it was. Rather strange, being a Coptic Christian himself. Perhaps he didn't speak Coptic. There are a lot of Coptics in Egypt who don't speak Coptic. But he said he just couldn't make head. He didn't even know what it was about. For 25 years, he said he had the manuscript, but he couldn't tell you what it was. But as I've told you before, there's a little title on the book which makes it abundantly clear. You don't even have to know Coptic to know what it is. Eugelian Judas, anybody will know. In Evangel of Judas, Gospel of Judas. It should have been easy. I mean, I can't read Coptic, but that was too easy to interpret. And he had this on the book the whole time, the manuscript, but claimed he never knew what it was. The reason is he probably knew full well what it was, but realized that he was not allowed to sell the manuscript and transfer it out of Egypt without government permission, which in this case would most certainly not have been given. This is a Coptic manuscript of which had no equals, found in Egypt. It should have landed up in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. And he, however, just pretended and feigned lack of knowledge. But despite that, he put a price of $3 million on the book. I mean, he knows it's old. That's all it is. But it may have just been a fairy story. It could have been anything. Now, he knew, I'm certain he knew what he had in his hands, and that it would provoke a tremendous amount of interest, because the Gospel of Judas was known to exist from Irenaeus, who the famous French theologian of just the 2nd century. And he quotes the Gospel of Judas, and he quoted it accurately because passages he quoted are in the book as it was found. So it wasn't something that people didn't know what the book was about. But he just slapped a price of $3 million on the manuscript. So one day a red-headed woman named Mia came to visit him on behalf of her colleagues and said, we want to buy your manuscript, very interested in it. And they were commissioned to do so by a Greek guy called Nicholas Kotolakos. He was a Greek antiquities dealer, but he was selling antiquities in Cairo as well, like the others were. And he had a few things like in common with Judas Iscariot himself. The dealers in Cairo called him Louchi, Louchi. Louchi means he's a cross-eyed crook, that you can't trust him. He may look at you this way or that way, but his eyes are always doing this. That's where he got his reputation from. One of them, his colleagues said, you had to be careful when dealing with him. We never knew where he was looking. But he was well known. And Hannah allowed him and his group to come into his home. He said, can I come to your home and have a look and see what you've got? Yes, and he showed them all his artifacts, and he showed him the Gospel of Judas, not apparently or saying he didn't know what it was. So they had a good look at everything, and they were very happy with it. And they said, sure, we'll buy it from you, $3 million. There you are, no problem, we'll buy it from you. So Hannah thinks he's got this wonderful sale, $3 million. But the very next day, there's a burglary in his home, according to him. And in the burglary, all of his artifacts disappear, and including this manuscript. So that's already he's getting betrayed himself in the process. And Hannah must have known who had stolen the manuscript, because he himself had cheated Kotolakos sometime earlier with a fake artifact which he had Kotolakos had paid $150 for. There were, it's anywhere in that part of the world there are fakes, there are, what have you. It's just the sort of thing you can expect to find. So Kotolakos, I think, was just giving him back a bit of a test of his own manuscript. So eventually, Kotolakos, he was confronted by Hannah, and he just said, no, I didn't steal your things, nothing. I had nothing to do with it, but I do happen to know where they are. Without explaining how he knew that. He says, I know where they are. He said, and the manuscript's gone out of Egypt. These other people have taken it to Geneva in Switzerland. So, if you want to get it back, we're going to have to make a trip to Switzerland, which they duly did. They went to Geneva, and while they were there, he met with Kutalakis, who had the manuscript in his hands. And he said, I want everything returned. And Kutalakis, because of what had happened before, said, the only thing I'm prepared to give you back is the Judas manuscript. So it was obvious what had happened. Kutalakis had betrayed him by stealing all his artifacts and everything, just as Hannah had betrayed Kutalakis in the same way. And this becomes a fact and a fingerprint on every negotiation that follows. It's just betrayal, cheating, blackmail, one thing after another as this manuscript moves around. And it's hard to know the full story. We can't really tell how much of that story is true. That may have been cooked up between them just to get the manuscript out of Egypt. We don't know quite what the whole story behind it is. But it was shifted out of Egypt, and they were not allowed to do that. It was a serious thing. He could have gone to prison for 6 years for doing that, whoever took it out. But it was out. It had got to Geneva. And over there in Geneva, a guy called Stephen Emmel, who was a professor of Coptic studies in Switzerland, had a look at it. He's just to see what it was. And he couldn't tell what it was at the time. He wasn't sure himself. But he said the meeting itself was, he says it had an air of cloak and dagger about it the whole time. He said you'd watch Hannah and he would look at you as suspiciously all the time, and he would do this, and he wouldn't want to disclose too many things. And he said you could tell all along there was so much shady stuff going on. He said it was incredible. His actual words were, the meeting was extremely secretive. The manuscript was smuggled out of Egypt. I think there was no question that this material should have remained in Egypt. But with every negotiation, you see what Crosney starts to call the curse of Judas. He wasn't a Christian, Herbert Crosney, not at all. But he said himself, he says, I have to admit, there seems to be a curse on that manuscript. Wherever it goes, whoever gets their hands on it and tries to buy it gets cheated one way or another, or the seller as well. So Hannah then deposited the manuscript in a bank in Geneva, and in 1984, this is now 5 years after its discovery, he took it to the USA, but found that no one was interested there. So then he decided in the USA to deposit it in New York, in that area on Long Island, a place called Hicksville. And he went into a bank there, and you have these places where you can put your jewelry and everything. So he bought a box and he put the manuscript in there, not thinking or realizing that New York gets rather humid in summer. And as a result, more damage was done just by the atmosphere to the manuscript in the short time it was there. It was there for 4 years, and in that time it did more damage than 1,600 years, of sort of decay when it was in Egypt, because Egypt is, very dry as a country, so it didn't do much damage to it at all. And he was a bit horrified when he found it, but he then met a woman. Sorry, at the time, not a woman, I'm going too fast. Where am I? He then met a woman called Frieda Nussberger, a German woman, who was showing interest in the manuscript herself. They met in Manhattan on the 3rd of April 2000, and she paid him $300,000 for it. He said he paid only $2,000. So she now pays him $300,000. But she was shocked to see it in the state it was in, from the humidity. It was in a very decrepit condition. So Hannah had betrayed her. The betrayals just go one after the other, the cheating, the misrepresenting. And she then passed the manuscript on to Yale University. And they identified it finally, positively, as the Gospel of Judas. They said, this is the long-lost Gospel of Judas. There's no question about it. But at the time, the university refused to buy it, even though Yale University majors on ancient antiquities and things like that. They said, we don't want to touch this. We want nothing to do with this. It wasn't because of the manuscript that it was the Gospel of Judas. It was just all the skullduggery that was going on around it. So Nussberger, who herself didn't, or said she never knew anything about Christianity, she had no sort of Christian leanings, she said, I didn't know what it was because I didn't know anything about Gospels. I never knew what a Gospel was. But she says that when she started hearing about it, and nobody was translating it, nobody really knew what the content was. But she said that she suddenly felt that she was called to rehabilitate Judas Iscariot from, being so maligned in the Christian scriptures. So she said she started looking for a buyer for the manuscript herself. And then eventually she sold it to an antiquities dealer, a guy called Bruce Farini from Akron, Ohio. Purchase price was $2.5 million. From $300,000, which is what she paid for it, she sells it for $2.5 million. But despite her claims to want to vindicate Jesus, she did exactly what he did. He wanted money out of it. It's quite clear that was her aim. She was only interested in making a substantial profit. I put in my book on this, 13 new pieces of silver. This is really what all this is. It's just the same sort of thing as what you have in Matthew's Gospel. But Farini betrayed her as well. He gave her 2 post-dated checks. Those days you still had them, for $1.25 million each. I mean, anybody in their right mind knows that a post-dated check is just a piece of paper which has an undertaking to honor a payment to you of some amount that you hope at the time you will have to give, which you haven't got at the moment. But the result was that she even showed a complete indiscretion, lack of discretion completely, when she passed the codex on to him. She gave it to him, and she took the 2 checks in reply, and he walked off with it. I mean, can you imagine with this kind of money being passed aside, that a person could be so foolish as to pass that on to the other person? We don't really know entirely exactly what went on, but this tells you enough to know what was going on behind the scenes. These post-dated checks are presumably given with good intentions, but they're nothing but slips of paper of, I hope to be able to pay you on the day. But she didn't even stipulate, didn't even have a written agreement with him that she would retain ownership. I mean, I'm an attorney. This is what you do in any contract like this. The person retains ownership till you pay him the full amount. It's like a property deal. You buy property on terms for 200,000. Let's say you buy it for 2 million rand, put down a deposit of 200,000, and then you get your bond. Only when that's registered and you get paid the full 2 million does the ownership pass. She didn't even have an attorney around there, nothing to protect her interests, if that is the truth. He'd put it in a humid safe deposit box. What Bruce Farini does now, he stores it in a deep freeze. So he deteriorated further. I mean, I think I've shown you pictures of it. Oh, dear, oh dear. Anyway, as far as we can see, the curse of Judas continues. Nussberger was shocked on the resale just to see its decayed condition. It was literally falling apart. And this is what she said. As I took a glimpse of what was on the table, the leaves were loose and tiny fragments were floating around. My head shrank. Judas didn't want to let me go. He was holding on to me and he was torturing me. He chose me to rehabilitate him. It was as if Judas was fighting on my side, trying to protect me from the blows, leading me through the labyrinth to the final salvation. You just can't credit that. It's times it's just, underworld stuff at its best, and at other times it's just childish ridiculousness. It was all just wanting to make big money out of something, and that was all. And Krosny himself, I love his comment on this. He says, up to this point, Nussberger had regarded herself purely as a secularist with no specific religious inclinations. She didn't even know what a gospel was. Meanwhile, now all of a sudden, Judas has commissioned her to, rehabilitate him and, give him a better image in the world. Nussberger herself said that when everything went wrong, she said it was as if the genie had been released from the magical lamp of Aladdin. I put a note here, I said, in my book, I said, perhaps it had. Perhaps that's just what had happened. A genie was released when the original manuscript came out, because this is just exactly where you expect to find things like demonic possession and activity in that part of the world, which is very common right throughout the Middle East. We have very few experiences of people who are demon possessed, unless you get into outside ministry, and you soon find it. But that part of the world, I know from another book I've read about the Middle East, that demonic possession and demonic activity is very, very common. But now Farini, who has betrayed her, suddenly now finds himself in financial straits and files for bankruptcy, that he can't pay her. Now, she's totally betrayed. He goes to get himself declared insolvent, and which means he doesn't have to pay her the 2.4 million that was owing to her. And not only that, she demanded the manuscript back at the same time. And of course, his promissory checks were never honored. And Nussberger was devastated when she found that he had taken a few pages out of the manuscript. He's just torn them out. And as James Robinson says, what has transpired in this money-making venture is not a pleasant story. Yeah, he had played around with it, and when she got it back, it was now damaged more than ever and got nothing to show for it. So he had betrayed Nussberger, that's Farini. She had betrayed Hannah in only paying him $300,000 for a text that she promptly resold for 2.5 million. But now she handed it to Rodolphe Casso, who is a Swiss professor of Coptic studies at the University of Geneva. So finally, the manuscript gets into genuine hands. He was a professor of studies there at the university, and National Geographic finally publicized it in one of its issues in 2006. They brought out their usual National Geographic magazine. This was all over the cover of it. They brought out this DVD, National Geographic, The Gospel of Judas. And they brought out this small book at the same time, The Gospel of Judas. The discovery of the Gospel of Judas is astonishing, is the writing on the front of this. So by this time, it was supposedly in good hands. National Geographic, supposed to be one of these honorable American institutions, but if anybody knows them well, it's very strongly anti-Christian. Strong scientific evolutionary approach to everything that they ever study or deal with. That's what National Geographic's all about, and a very anti-religious sort of attitude. So you don't find yourself too surprised when you find that this book lands up in their hands. But what National Geographic did, as I mentioned before last week, is that it knew it couldn't buy the manuscript. It knew that manuscript had to go back to Egypt. So they talked about it with the lawyers and everything. And once the lawyers get involved, they come up with all sorts of ideas. And the lawyers said, well, why don't you buy the right to the content of the manuscript? What you do is you copy every page and you pay $1 million for that, which is what they did. Very clever sidestep. So they paid Nussberger. Eventually, she got $1 million out. So she made a profit of $700,000. And National Geographic formed a trust known as the Maecenas Foundation for Ancient Art, and also promised her royalties out of the proceeds that they might make out of publicizing it. And they said she stood to gain up to $4 million, Frieda Nussberger, out of the whole deal. So it looks like she came out, on the winning side of the whole experience. It betrayed her, National Geographic said. Even Krosny says this in his book. This book of his, he says, this is finally, the manuscript's in good hands. Now everything's going properly. It's being looked after properly. It's honest, honorable people, National Geographic. This Nussberger is a fine woman, she hasn't done anything wrong herself. And she even was promoted as the heroine of the story for doing her best to protect and preserve the manuscript. The truth's the other way around. At the same time, roughly, the Los Angeles Times did an investigation of this whole thing. And they found out in April 2006, same time as National Geographic publicized it, that Nussberger had been arrested by the Italian authorities on unrelated charges of trafficking in looted art. So she ends up now in trouble for what, the way she got the manuscript and everything. She was Krosny and them, when they try and make her out that she was honorable and good, absolute nonsense. And she got an 18-month suspended sentence. She was sentenced to 18 months imprisonment, and it was given an 18-month suspended sentence at the time, in exchange for information on the antiquities trade. They said, we will let you go, we'll give you in a suspended sentence, provided you disclose everything you know about what's going on in the antiquities trade. On the same day, the New York Times reported the same story. And they said, Chakos, that was her surname, that was her nickname, willingness to talk, has led some dealers to call her the Judas of the antiquities trade. So now she's betraying everybody. One by one, she's giving them all the information they want. I haven't a clue as to what that led to afterwards, arrests and prosecutions probably, but all so that she could just duck and hide away. So in the end, she managed to get her profit out of the manuscript, but in most nefarious circumstances. N.T. Wrightworth, famous British bishop, says the story is a fascinating tale of seemingly endless phone calls, plane journeys, bad deals, scholarly jealousy, intrigue, suspicion, hopes raised and dashed and raised again. That's the whole story of it from the time it started. And I just ended my book putting it like this. The spirit of Judas Iscariot lives on, and so does the curse attached to that manuscript. Yeah, amazing story. It's just too coincidental that everything there cut people up one way or another, and one after the other shoots the next person down the line. And there's this manuscript, as one of the books I read said of it, if Judas Iscariot was still alive, he might have been proud, of the way these people did their negotiations.